GHG overview. We will now shift from talking about the PSD general requirements to looking at greenhouse gases and how the PSD requirements would apply to greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are pollutants that trap heat in the atmosphere and are associated with climate change. Under the EPA's rulemaking, greenhouse gases are a single air pollutant defined as the aggregate group of the following 6 gases or classes of gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, and perfluorocarbons. Here's a list of some of the sources of each of the greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the most familiar of the greenhouse gases. It's associated with fossil fuel combustion and, to a lesser extent, is released through some manufacturing processes. Methane is the primary component of natural gas, and it's released from the handling of natural gas as well as through the decomposition of material in landfills. Greenhouse gases also include nitrous oxide, which is a less common oxide of nitrogen. NO and NO2 are more common and regulated collectively as NOx. Highly fluorinated compounds are also greenhouse gases. Sulfur hexafluoride, for example, is released from magnesium production and processing and is used in components of electrical transmission and distribution systems. The other 2 groups of fluorinated compounds, that is HFCs and PFCs, are used in semiconductor manufacturing and are associated with aluminum processing. CO2 equivalent, or CO2e, is a measure used to compare and aggregate the emissions of the various greenhouse gases based on their relative global warming potential, or GWP. The global warming potential is based on the cumulative effect of the gas over a specified time horizon, resulting from a unit mass of gas relative to the reference gas, which is CO2. Thus, CO2 would have a global warming potential of 1. CO2 equivalent emissions equal the mass of the greenhouse gas times the GWP of that greenhouse gas. Current global warming potentials are listed in this chart. For HFCs and PFCs, it varies with the chemical in each class of the chemical. The ratios may be revised over time. The current ratios under PSD are set in Table A1 of the Mandatory Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rule, which is codified in Subpart A of 40 CFR Part 98. In June 2010, EPA issued the Tailoring Rule, which addresses the applicability of PSD and Title V to greenhouse gas emissions. The rule can be found at the website listed on this page. The Tailoring Rule does not change the basic applicability processes of PSD or Title V. However, it does incorporate a way to determine if emissions are in an amount that makes greenhouse gases a regulated NSR pollutant, based on the level of CO2e emissions. Under the Tailoring Rule, applicability is determined in a 2-step process that evaluates first whether the CO2 emissions are subject to regulation by being over the regulated NSR pollutant thresholds, and second, whether the mass emissions are over the PSD, major source, and/or significant emissions rate thresholds that are part of the traditional PSD program. The application of PSD to greenhouse gas emission sources is being implemented in steps. The applicability criteria change along the way. And this is all from the Tailoring Rule, again, that was issued back in June 2010. For Step 1, the applicability criteria applies to permits that are issued between the dates of January 2nd, 2011 and June 30th, 2011. Step 2 applies to permits that are issued on or after January 1st, 2011. So this would be Step 1 and Step 2 of the Tailoring Rule. Note that Step 1 does not stop when Step 2 phases in. if a source or modification would trigger PSD under Step 1, it will continue to trigger PSD even after July 1st, 2011. Criteria may change later in a Step 3 action of the tailoring rule, but for now, we don't know the outcome of that, and we will focus, for the purposes of this training, on these first two steps. Okay, so in addition to the tailoring rule, EPA issued the PSD and Title V permitting guidance for greenhouse gases in November of 2010. This will assist permitting agencies and permit applicants as they are applying the tailoring rule to the traditional PSD program and how it gets applied to greenhouse gases. This document that was issued in November 2010 elaborates on the contents of the tailoring rule. It describes regulatory terms and requirements. It reiterates past guidance that's relevant to permitting of greenhouse gases. It provides recommendations and suggested methods for addressing the requirements of PSD and Title V for greenhouse gases. And it illustrates through examples applicability determinations and back determinations for greenhouse gases. This presentation is derived from that guidance that I just spoke of. The guidance document contains information and examples addressing PSD applicability, BACT, and other provisions in Title V requirements. The guidance contains several appendices designed to assist applicants and regulators, including applicability flowcharts, a numeric applicability example, and several qualitative BACT examples. So as you see here, this is the outline of the guidance document. It goes through PSD applicability, requirements of the BACT analysis, other PSD requirements, Title V requirements, the applicability flowcharts, example calculations, 3 BACT examples, and then various informational resources. So now we'll talk about greenhouse gas applicability criteria. As stated before, the tailoring rule does not change the basic PSD applicability process. However, incorporation of greenhouse gases into the definition of regulated NSR pollutant does mean that the applicability analysis will require one to determine the emissions on both a CO2e basis and a mass basis. The CO2 equivalent sum is used to determine if the greenhouse gas emissions are subject to regulation and therefore a regulated NSR pollutant. The mass sum is used to determine if the source is a major source or the existing source is undergoing a major modification. Under Step 1 of the tailoring rule, which applies from January 2nd, 2011 to June 30th, 2011, PSD applies to GHG emissions of a new source if the new source is otherwise subject to PSD for another regulated NSR pollutant, and if the new source greenhouse gas potential is both equal to or greater than 75,000 tons per year on a CO2e basis and greater than 0 tons per year on a mass basis. Of these two criteria, it is the 75,000 tons per year CO2e that is controlling for new sources. Also, please note that the PSD thresholds are expressed in short tons, which is 2,000 pounds. The greenhouse gas reporting rule, however, is carried out in metric tons. A metric ton is 1,000 kilograms, or slightly more than 2,200 pounds. Therefore, if reporting data or factors are used, they will need to be converted. Since there are 1.1 PSD tons in a reporting rule ton, the applicant and the permitting authority will need to make sure that the correct measures and the correct units are used when determining ton under PSD. For new sources on or after July 1st, 2011, PSD applies to the greenhouse gases if the source is otherwise subject to PSD for another pollutant and the GHGs pollutant or potential to emit is both equal to or greater than 75,000 tons and greater than 0 tons per year on a mass basis. Obviously, this is the same. It is the same that would bring in sources under step 1 for new sources for step 1 of the tailoring rule. Also, though, under step 2, the source would be brought in under the program if the source has a greenhouse gas potential to emit that is greater than or equal to 100,000 tons per year on a CO2e basis and over 100 or 250 tons per year on a mass basis. Okay, so for modifications at existing sources under step 1, this would be again from January 2nd through June 30th of 2011. PSD applies to greenhouse gases if the modification is otherwise subject to PSD for another regulated NSR pollutant, and the greenhouse gas emissions increase of both the project and the net emissions increase over the contemporaneous period are both equal to or greater than 75,000 tons per year of CO2e and greater than 0 tons per year on a mass basis. So for step 2, PSD applies to the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with a modification in one of 3 possible instances. First, the modification is subject to PSD under step 1 of the tailoring rule. As I mentioned before, the step 1 applicability carries forward into step 2. Or you can have both the existing source potential to emit for greenhouse gases is equal to or greater than 100,000 tons per year on a CO2e basis, and 100 to 50 tons per year on a mass basis, and the modification emissions increase of greenhouse gases and the net emissions increase is equal to or greater than 75,000 tons per year CO2e and greater than 0 tons per year on a mass basis. And finally, there's a third way. The modification alone has greenhouse gas emissions that are equal to or greater than 100,000 tons per year on a CO2e basis and 100 or 250 tons per year on a mass basis. So it would be previously a minor source, and then the modification alone would make it a major source and therefore bring it in to the program. So it may also be helpful to think of the PSD applicability for greenhouse gases at an existing major source to be a 4-part test. For a modification to trigger PSD at an existing major source, all 4 of the listed conditions must exist. The CO2e emission increase must equal to or exceed 75,000 tons per year of CO2e. The net emissions increase of CO2e equals or exceeds 75,000 tons per year as well. The greenhouse gas mass emissions increase exceeds 0 tons per year, and the net emissions increase of greenhouse gas on a mass emissions over the contemporaneous period exceeds 0 tons per year. Because any one of these tests will exclude a project from PSD, it is not important what order they are applied or that all 4 are completed. In a real instance, the permitting applicant may know one of these tests will keep the project out of PSD, and only that test need to be applied to the project during an applicability demonstration. Let's now turn to the task of determining greenhouse gas emissions for purposes of determining PSD applicability. Greenhouse gases must be determined in 2 ways. One must determine the sum of the 6 greenhouse gas pollutants on a mass basis, and then they must also determine the sum of the 6 greenhouse gas pollutants on a CO2e basis. All emissions of greenhouse gases must be included. Emissions analysis under PSD goes beyond what is required to comply with the reporting rule, that is the mandatory reporting rule. For example, biogenic sources that are not covered by the mandatory reporting rule must still be determined. These include the use of biofuels, the emissions from landfills, wastewater systems, and fermentation processes. Also, there are no de minimis size thresholds for any types of sources under PSD. Also, when determining PSD applicability, there is no consideration of off-site emission impacts on GHG emissions. As with any emissions analysis, one must use the best available data to determine the emissions. Data quality hierarchy is for all pollutants. Generally, the more unit-specific the emissions data, the better. And this would include possibly performance tests on similar units, mass balances, vendor data and guarantees, test data from EPA, AP42 factors that are put together by EPA, and factors from various literature. There are a number of useful emission factor resources. One is the Greenhouse Gas Mandatory Reporting Rule. The rule establishes greenhouse gas reporting requirements for most sectors, and the basic approaches to determining emissions under this rule can be used to estimate emissions for PSD purposes. The rule also includes procedures for estimating GHG emissions from many of the largest source categories. And the website listed here will get you to that rulemaking. Other sources of useful information for determining emissions include procedures that are created under the Energy Star program, which is a program under EPA. The methods used in the EPA's National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and the protocols adopted in the EPA Climate Leaders Initiative. All of these websites are listed on this slide. Lastly, EPA has gathered extensive information on how best to determine greenhouse gas emissions through the voluntary partnerships of greenhouse gas reductions. Here are a number of references and the websites where they can be found. And on this slide, we list a number of resources relative to the emissions of SF6 and PFCs from the key manufacturing sources of those greenhouse gases. EPA's mandatory reporting rule for greenhouse gases contains estimation methods for methane from landfills. However, it does not contain methods for carbon dioxide emissions from landfills. This technical guidance document describes emission estimation techniques for greenhouse gas air emissions from solid waste disposal, wastewater treatment, and ethanol fermentation facilities. All are anthropogenic source categories that can produce greenhouse gas emissions through biological processes involving living organisms, which is, in other words, biogenic emissions. Whether there is a EPA reference document or not, sources are responsible for including all greenhouse gas emissions in their applicability analysis and will need to propose methods for assessing and measuring their emissions that are adequate for greenhouse gas permitting requirements. Permitting authorities will need to review these methods to determine their appropriate application for greenhouse gas permitting. The following slides present flowcharts for applicability determinations for 4 cases. That is, the new source in the first 6 months of 2011, that's the first step under tailoring rules, step 1. New sources after, on or after July 2011, which is second step of the tailoring rule. Existing sources in the tailoring rule, step 1. Existing sources under tailoring rule, step 2. Of course, all of these flowcharts assume that the applicants who are required to get a permit will actually be applying for a permit and not trying to avoid permitting. And we will walk through each of these slides just in a general way and allow the reader to to look at the slides. These slides are all taken straight out of the GHG permitting guidance. So we also refer the reader to the guidance itself. One point of reference for this first slide is that we have a footnote in here that is a footnote that's derived from the tailoring rule. That is, if a minor source construction permit is issued to a source prior to July 1st, 2011, and that permit does not contain a synthetic minor limitation on greenhouse gas emissions, and a source has a potential to emit of greenhouse gas emissions that would trigger PSD on or after July 1st, 2011, then the source must either begin actual construction on that permit prior to July 1st, 2011, or seek a permit revision to include a minor source limit for that greenhouse gas emission. So if either of these two things does not occur, the source must obtain a PSD permit for greenhouse gas emissions, again, if they do not begin actual construction prior to July 1st, 2011. So I'm going to just have about 1 minute on each of these slides and allow the reader to look through them. And again, these slides come directly from the PSD permitting guidance issued in November 2010.